Hello and a warm welcome to Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai International Lit Fest, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so please do send in your questions in the comments section of the platform you are viewing from, and don't forget to mention your name. Padma Bhushan recipient for outstanding achievement in art and education. Barbara Stoller Miller, Professor of Indian Art at Columbia University, New York. Vidya Dehejia has combined research with teaching and exhibition-related activities around the world in an illustrious career spanning over 40 years. Her book, India, A Story Through 100 Objects, tells the story of India not through monarchs and battles, but sheds light on the rich multicultural medley that is today's India by piecing together her story of the subcontinent through 100 exquisite and unusual objects. Let's dive into this fascinating world of art and history with solid treasure. A straight talk by Vidya Dehejia.
It's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you and to share a few highlights from my recent book, India, A Story Through 100 Objects. A story through objects? Why might be your first question. My answer would be, why now? Why ever not? We're constantly surrounded by objects in our homes, in our offices, wherever we are. We're surrounded by those things that enable our everyday life, that channel and dictate them, things that we take for granted. But these objects speak to us. They also speak about us, and they have a story to tell. A story that reflects our values, our aspirations, sometimes our achievements, often our dreams. And objects reveal more about us than we realize. Just think about it. We go into a person's home, we look around and we immediately form some judgments, right? For that matter, you might have found some judgments about me. You might be able to see that there are flowers behind me and that there is a silver jug. Maybe you can or can't see it, but you form some judgments from all of that. So my book focuses on 100 objects to tell a story of India. How was I going to organize this? Chronology is important, but chronology by itself would have been pretty tedious, pretty boring. So what I did was to choose a set of thematic sections that would allow the objects to take center stage. Thematic sections like the idealized body, the urge to adorn, intercultural encounters, scientific insights, ideals of womanhood. And I chose to let the objects take center stage. I wanted these 100 objects to shed light on the varying priorities evident over time in India, the differing strands of achievement that arose over the ages to create this rich multicultural medley that is today's India. It is a multifaceted culture that has had room for varying priorities and different points of view. That has always been India's strength, and that is still her strength today. So it is a story. It's an idiosyncratic story at that, since I'm not sure that there really is any such thing as a totally neutral or detached point of view. Choosing those 100 objects was truly a difficult task. Now think about it, just 100 objects to tell a story of well over 4,000 years, 4,000 at the very least. As you, as readers, skim through the book, many of you will wonder why an object you consider as important is not there. So let me repeat, making choices was truly difficult. Finally, I decided that if my readers would give me an occasional really, or who knew, I would be satisfied. I felt I would have achieved my aim. And you can well imagine how tricky it's going to be for me to choose something like 10 out of those 100 objects for the half hour that we have together today. Let me start with one of my favorite objects. Quite apart from its beauty, you will soon see that it sheds light, an unexpected light, on a very early period in India's history. So what do we have here? We have an ivory figurine. She's just under 10 inches high, so she's quite small. She's exquisitely carved, sensuous form, and richly, richly adorned. Look at the row of bangles all the way from wrist to elbow, or the anklets from the knee down all the way to the foot, and all the other gorgeous adornment. She is the exact counterpart of the figures on the Sanchi stupa near Bhopal in central India, a stupa that was carved and completed in sandstone, of course, not in ivory, between about the year 50 BCE and the turn of the era, the year zero, if there is such a thing as the year zero. What is extraordinary about her is that she was found in 1938 when excavations were conducted at the Roman town of Bombay. She had been buried under a mountain of ash. Mount Vesuvius that you see in the background there had erupted in the year 79, almost 2,000 years ago, and buried this rich, exquisite Roman town and all its contents and its inhabitants with ash. And she was part of that. How did she get to Pompeii in the year 79? She speaks to the fact that those centuries, the few centuries BCE and CE, were an age of mercantile enterprise. The most significant Indian export those days was pepper. It was in high demand in Rome. It's funny, we found a recipe book recently, which has 400 recipes, a Roman recipe book. 395 of those 400 use black pepper, which comes only from India. Later on, it also comes from Southeast Asia, but at this time from India. Extraordinary, isn't it, to think of the fact that India was never isolated from the rest of the world. It was in constant contact, largely through trade. What purpose did she serve? There is a hole that goes through her head up to her hips. And what we think is that she was part of a beautiful piece of furniture in an aristocratic, wealthy household, wood with ivory decoration. I don't know what sort of chair you're sitting in. The one I'm sitting in has got slats that go down the back of the chair. And that probably is how she functioned in an extremely wealthy household. Let me move to another object, from something 10 inches tall to this is about 6 feet in height. And what are you seeing? You're seeing God Shiva and Goddess Parvati. This particular piece is from Odisha. I could have chosen a piece from the north, the south, the east, the west, central India. Across the country, we have images of God and Goddess, Shiva and Parvati, or Vishnu and Lakshmi, as a loving couple, as a married couple in embrace. If you look closely, you can see that Parvati has her right arm around Shiva's neck. Shiva has his left arm cupping her breast. They look into each other's eyes. This exquisite interaction between the divine couple that the artist has highlighted. And you might say, why? What? Why is it that we find images of this type all the way across India? Let me ask you to think in terms of prasad. When a Hindu goes to a temple, they take a tray of offerings with them usually. It might have a banana, a few blossoms, maybe coconut, red kumkum powder, and you give it to the priest, and the priest offers it to the deity who blesses it. And then you very often get a portion of that back. Maybe one blossom is given back to you as prasad, as blessing. We have something very similar here, and it's expressed very clearly in the inscriptions. By presenting an image of this type, or by presenting a poem that expresses the love of God and Goddess, you are asking for it to be blessed and for a portion of that joy to come back to you as a married couple. And the inscriptions, there are many inscriptions which actually speak to this. There's one, for instance, of the year 1201, which records the foundation of a Shiva temple in UP. And it says, "May Shiva, who experienced the delight of an embrace from Parvati, multiply your delight." In other words, it's an offering which will come back to you partially in the form of prasad. There are exactly the same about Vishnu and Lakshmi. It says, "May Lakshmi's hand, which is caressing the neck of Vishnu, grant you happiness." Something completely different. Zero. Zero is a concept so familiar that we can't imagine a time when it didn't exist. But there was such a time. Zero is, of course, nothing. Yet it's that absolutely indispensable nothing. And at the other end of the scale, we have infinity, which is everything, which is limitless, which is an inconceivably large number. When you subtract anything from infinity, it doesn't make any difference to it. These two concepts, zero is a concept that was, shall I say, invented or used extensively in India from a very early date. What you're looking at is a manuscript which is now in Oxford and has been carbon dated to the 4th century, 1600 years ago. And it's a very practical document. It is calculations by merchants on what money is due and isn't due, but it has the zero in it. It's interesting that a zero as a number, as a unit to be added to the numbers 1 to 9, that is the Indian contribution. And by doing that, your 1 became a 10, then 100, then 1,000, 10,000, and so on, an Indian invention. It's interesting that it arose in a country in which there were philosophical concepts that sort of mesh with the mathematical concepts. You have the idea in philosophy of nothingness, of shunyata. And then, of course, at the other end, you have infinity, ananta. And it appears as if the philosophical ideas of nothingness and infinity went hand in hand with mathematical ideas of zero and the infinite. So where are we now? We're looking at an album page of Mughal Emperor Jahangir. These albums, which we call murakkas, how do I put it to you to make it more familiar? It's like a scrapbook that you as children might have put together, where you pasted all your favorite images together. That's what an album, a murakka of the Mughal emperors is. They took their favorite images and their skilled artists put them together on pages so that you have a separate image of Emperor Jahangir with the artist's name in the border on the right, the white border, and an independent image of Christ bearing the cross with another artist's name. And their skilled artists have pasted them together, put them together, added borders, and made this exquisite sort of page. Jesus Jahangir's father, Akbar, was the one who invited the Jesuits to come to the Mughal court. And when the Jesuits came there, they brought with them the Antwerp Polyglot Bible, as it's called. And Emperor Akbar, and after him, as you see, Jahangir, asked their artists to copy some of the images from this Antwerp Bible. And that is the origin of a page like this. Let's look at something else. This now that you see is marble. It's a tombstone. It's an Islamic tombstone. Beautifully carved. The lettering is absolutely exquisite. Gujarat in the 15th century and before was an Islamic, under Islamic rule. Ahmad Shah had just built the capital of Ahmedabad. But what is really interesting about this Islamic tombstone is its find spot. You can see that it is found in Aden. It's heavy. It's 300 pounds of marble, which was exported all the way to Aden, but not just there. We have found these exports across the Indian Ocean rim, so that we have 12 of them in Sumatra, which is the largest of the Indonesian islands. We've got 3 in Eastern Java. In the West, we've got them in Tanzania. We've got them in Somalia. We've got them in Iran's coastal belt called Lars. What we find is that wealthy merchants and also imams actually commissioned these marble tombstones to be made in Kambat in Gujarat, and they had them exported, heavy as they are, in the ships that traveled along these areas as part of trade. We tend to think of globalization as something that occurred in the 20th century. It has always been there, and India was always part of this globalization from very early days. What do we have here? On one side, we have something familiar, a bronze, a chola bronze of God Krishna, who is dancing on the hood of serpent Kaliya. Some of you may know the story. Kaliya had poisoned the waters of the Jamna, and people living along the Jamna were in dire straits. And Krishna, of course, is asked to do something, and he subdues Kaliya. And Kaliya promises never again to pollute the waters of the Jamna. But what do we have on the other side? We have a page, a Mughal album, a Mughal page, where you can see Krishna, once again, yellow-robed Krishna dancing on the head of serpent Kaliya. This is an Akbar page. Emperor Akbar was an interesting individual. He decided that he was ruling over this very varied population. And one of the things he wanted to do was to translate the Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, into Persian. And then he asked his artists to illustrate these texts. It's an interesting thing. It's an amazing testimony to a time when the ruling power was willing to explore at least the validity of differing faiths and differing points of view. I was talking about the Indian Ocean rim, and what you see here is images, Buddhist and Hindu, from Thailand, from Sri Lanka, from Java, from Cambodia. I could talk about all of them if I had the time, but the one I'm actually going to speak about is the Afghanistan linga. Today, we tend to think of Afghanistan in terms of war, in terms of Western intervention, in terms of tribal warfare. But it's important to remember that between sort of 800 and 1100, Afghanistan was under the rule of the Hindu Shahis, Shahi, perhaps from Shah. And the rulers were Hindu rulers. We have an inscription of a ruler who calls himself, his name is Jayapala Deva, and he calls himself Maharaja di Raja Parameshwara. And he starts his inscription with the praise of Shiva, who sports the third eye in his forehead. And he speaks of a person in his court who built a temple to Shiva. And this marble linga was probably enshrined in one such Afghan temple under the Hindu Shahis. The Jains have always been a very important merchant community, particularly in Western India and Gujarat. And they were extremely successful in trade and amassed a large wealth. And they spent it on their faith. They built temples in marble, the most expensive of stones, and they commissioned copies of their sacred texts, particularly the one called the Kalpa Sutra that you're looking at here today. And these texts were often written not with ordinary ink, but with gold, as you see in this case. And these manuscripts were commissioned for the temples, for their bhandars, for their libraries. They used expensive lapis lazuli, ultramarine, red, and gold to create these wonderful images with these pert little figures, which if you look closely, you will see they have a protruding eye. It's a sort of a stylistic hallmark of Jain Gujarati painting of this period of the 15th century. Quite exquisite. And what do we have here on the other side of the screen? What you're seeing is, of course, a page from a Quran. It is one of 550 pages from a lavishly illustrated Quran that comes from Gwalior. Gwalior, and it has a date. So we've got 1399, almost 1400. Gwalior at this time was under the rule of Rajputs, of Tonwar Rajputs. So it's very interesting to see a Quran page coming from Gwalior. Of course, that they were also under the rule of the Delhi Sultanate, although Gwalior itself was ruled by the Rajputs. And what you're seeing here is a very unusual Quran. For those of you who know Qurans, you would know that it is normally only the written word on the page. And you can see the written word here in gold, then the next line blue, then gold again, red and gold. But what do we have between the lines of writing? We've got this absolutely rich floral vegetal display. This is not something you see in a Quran of later period or in any other part of the world. The text reigns supreme. But here, an artist creating these pages, 550 of them, they're all very similar, has used the floral motifs that are being used in temple architecture and in other such modes, and has introduced these lines of floral decoration, vegetal decoration. They're the cotton flower, actually, in between the lines of the Quran. And then they've mounted it on gorgeously decorated pages, which again repeat the floral design. We don't know who the artist was. We wish we knew more about the making of this Quran within the confines of what is a Hindu fortress. Those who have studied it in detail call it an ornamental puzzle. And it's interesting to ponder over something like that. Women, in some ways a troubling subject. Yes, we've had women in positions of high power, of course, In recent India, we've had prime ministers and presidents, and we've had Speaker of the House and governors and across the country. Yet the position of women is not where it should be. But let me turn to one woman who really made a mark in her time, and that is Noor Jahan, whom you see here. She is, of course, the wife of Emperor Jahangir. And what do we see her doing? She is holding effortlessly in one hand, a matchlock musket. And a musket like this would weigh at least 15 pounds. It's bulky. And it's difficult, but she's holding it so easily with one hand. And with the other, she's got the scouring stick with which she's tamping down the gunpowder into the musket so that it's ready to fire. And then if you notice around her waist, around that patka sash that she has, is a gunpowder flask from which she would have taken out the gunpowder to put it in to tamp it down. This is no mythical fancy. We've got Jahangir's memoirs called the Tuzuki Jahangiri, and he tells us of how amazing a markswoman Noor Jahan was. He tells us, he has many passages, and one of them says, you know, until now, such shooting was never seen, that from the top of an elephant and from inside a howdah, 6 shots could be made and not one miss, so that the 4 tigers found no opportunity to spring or to move. Noor Jahan was amazing. She had great power in her day and age. And by the year 1617, the gold and silver coins that were issued in the Mughal Empire had Jahangir's name on one side of the coin and Noor Jahan's name on the other side of the coin. In early 17th century Mughal India, Noor was a woman to be reckoned with. What do we have here? We have Raj Period Silver. So we are now talking about something like the 1870s. And you are seeing a tea service made for British usage. It is the British who had a teapot, a milk jug, a sugar bowl, and a kettle, which you see in the background, with extra hot water to pour in to replenish the tea once it had been poured out so that it could brew again. And this is a tea service made for British usage by Peter Orr and Sons of Madras. And it is covered with, look at the images, it is Hindu images. This type of silver was referred to as Swami silver because, of course, it's Swamis or gods that are depicted on it. What were the British doing with tea services covered with figures of Hindu gods? Normally, what they did was to have, this is 1805 Calcutta, the sort of teapot that they had. And how did Peter Orr and Sons move from that to this? Well, they tried an experiment. They took a jug, maybe it's a wine jug, maybe it's a water jug, and they put one band of Swamis around it to see whether they would get traction with it. And it was immensely popular. The Duke of Buckingham, who was Governor General of Madras, bought one, among other people. And once they started doing that, as you can see, there was no turning back. By the way, tea is a British introduction to India. It was the British who found the camellia leaf growing wild in Assam and decided to cultivate it. So that tea we call chai, it's really a cup of cha, the British word, which then became an Indian drink, although it's rarely drunk in this manner, that is with tea separate and milk separate and sugar separate. It's all boiled together, of course, we all know that. One other piece of Raj silver, which is interesting because it is obviously commissioned by a Parsi in Bombay in the year 1890. And it has 2 scenes from ancient Persian history on it. And you are, of course, wondering, how did it ever get to that? And the answer is that a Bombay Parsi commissioned or paid for a text of the ancient Persian world to be illustrated, and it was published in Bombay. And so these ancient scenes, what you've got here is the Fravashi Ahura Mazda in the center and Emperor Darius on one side, so that what you have is Bombay Parsi commissioning a scene from ancient Persia, that coastal strip of Iran called Parsi. And of course, we know that the Parsis came to India, to Gujarat, probably in the 10th century, maybe a little before, and the local ruler welcomed them there and said that they could follow their own religion, they could do everything they wanted to, except that they must speak the local language. And so the Parsis speak Gujarati. A minute or two on Chandigarh and this open hand. First of all, let me just say that this hand stands for peace and reconciliation. It's the hand that's open to give and the hand that's open to receive. And Chandigarh, of course, after the tragedy of partition, and of course, with Punjab being partitioned and Lahore, the capital of Punjab, going to Pakistan, Indian Punjab needed a new capital. And it arose in Chandigarh, and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru wanted it to be what he called a temple to the new India, unfettered by the traditions of the past. And he chose Le Corbusier. I mean, there was a series of trials and errors, but finally it was Corbusier who, using poured concrete, designed the whole of Chandigarh. Corbusier was very keen on having this symbol, the open hand, peace, reconciliation after the death, distress of partition, to settle people in a town with a better tomorrow. But it was only built, he even tried to persuade Nehru, saying it would stand for his non-alignment policy. But it was finally much later that Open Hand got built. And it is actually about 80 feet in height to the very top. And the hand itself is about 45 feet high. I will end with contemporary art. And I thought I would choose Mrinalini Mukherjee as the example. I don't know what you think of when you think of contemporary art. You might think of acrylic and mixed media on canvas, or you might imagine fiberglass sculptures or installation art or videos projected through rotating mylar cylinders. But I doubt that many of you would think of an ordinary thing like rope, just plain fabric. And Mrinalini Mukherjee took this common everyday medium, and she dyed it and she wove it. It was all done with the hand, no looms or anything. Finger-aching ingenuity is what one scholar writing about her speaks of. And she built up painstakingly from the bottom upwards these amazing sculptural forms that strike awe into the viewer. It took time. Sometimes some of these are twice life-size. And towards the end of her career with this particular medium, she sometimes made only one of these in an entire year. But I leave you with this image. And I realize I haven't spoken about the cover image. And maybe I leave it for those of you who have questions, and we'll pursue it then. So please, I open it up to Julian and to you, the audience.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was truly mesmerizing. I mean, a picturesque insight into who we really are as a people, like, a complete cultural amalgamation. So thank you so much. We have a couple of questions from our audience. Firstly, this question is from Aparna. What inspired you to tell the story of India through objects?
I think it's because objects do speak about us. What do you choose to surround yourselves with? What is it that you create? What is it that you admire? What is it that expresses you? Look around your own home, wherever you're sitting, and see what it is. Those objects do speak about you. They do tell a story. And I thought that one of the ways of dealing with this is to look at objects. Some of their objects are made by people like you. When you go to written history, archival history, those histories are generally written by the people in power. They are written by historians, and they are written from the point of view of the ruling power, whether that is the Gupta dynasty or the Chola dynasty, and they are archival, and they don't reflect the general population, the people. And I felt that looking at what is created by artists or by ordinary people, catering to what you and I want to be surrounded by or like to look at, reflects much more the sort of mood, the texture of a country than archival sources which come from a different point of view.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful, ma'am. If you could tell us a bit about the process that you followed to compile this book, because,
well,
I mean...
I started it out chronologically, and then I started it out geographically, trying to represent different parts of India. Mm-hmm. And as I tried to pull this together, there were umpteen objects that had to be discarded. For instance, I'd written a book about Chola bronzes, and I had to make sure that I didn't put too many Chola bronzes into this book to illustrate what I was doing. It was also, I realized that chronology on its own was going to be a very tedious way of telling a story, start from day one and keep going. There is a chronological framework. You've got to have that. But it seemed that if I could choose these sorts of thematic sections and have maybe anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6 objects expressing that particular thematic section, and then that underwent a whole lot of revision. Is this an important theoretical section? I mean, the art of contest. Should I have a section called the art of contests? And what would I put into that? The Maliki Maidan, the great cannon, which is today in Bijapur, or an ankusha, an elephant goad, because elephants were part of contest in those days. Mm-hmm. But so it went through a lot of initial revision, and a lot of objects had to be discarded. And right. I'm sure that you can see that there are objects that you would like to see there, which are not there.
Absolutely. In fact, I think our next question from Archana through YouTube, she has asked how many objects were eligible that you looked through before choosing these 100? I'm sure there were plenty.
As Gillian said in her introduction, I've been sort of teaching and doing exhibitions for 40 years. And I have come across a lot in the course of my teaching. I've also, my students have always been influential. They have always asked questions or talked about objects. They sent me suggestions. I welcome suggestions from anybody I was talking to. And it was a very, very difficult choice ultimately. as to whether to use one object or another to illustrate any individual point. So there was a lot of discards. I wrote various entries and then discarded them as well. So it was not only in the initial phase, but as I wrote it, I realized that it was not expressing it as fully. And perhaps if I used another object for the same idea, it would come out even better. So a lot of revision.
Mm-hmm. So is there, I mean, any reason you chose 100, the number 100, or was it just incidental?
I suppose you could go back to the origins of the British Museum publication of 100 objects. I mean, you know, that 100 objects to tell the history of the world. Neil McGregor did it. It was an amazing. It was a mission impossible almost, but he managed it. I thought about 100. I thought about 101 because in India we very often have that uneven number added to it. But finally, discussion with the publisher as well. We said, okay, let's stay with 100. The other thing was we wanted a book that could be handled. We wanted a text and an image that complemented each other. And the size of the book also ultimately said 100 seems okay as a round number, even though 101 may appeal to many as being more appropriate.
Perhaps that'll be another book from you in the future. Thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Siddhant via Facebook. Where are these objects now? For example, the Afghanistan Shiva Linga. Are they in museums around the world? And how many of these objects are in India?
That is a very good question. So the particular objects that I chose for this book were those of which I could get high resolution images so that you would have something which would be a pleasure to look at as well. Museums in India do not have high resolution images readily available of their collections, nor do they allow you readily to go in with proper equipment to take images, which means have appropriate lighting, perhaps open a case which has reflections on it in order to take images. And the result was, and I've had a lot of problem with taking images for one of my other books. The result was that I chose images mostly from Western collections, which already have photographed under proper lighting and other conditions and backdrop conditions, images, and were able to supply them readily. The wealth of India's heritage in objects is in India itself. The museums, every museum is filled with objects, and I could have easily taken every single object from an Indian museum, but the photography would have been a bit of a nightmare. And I decided, the publisher and I decided that we would choose objects that had, which we could get wonderful photographs of readily. So while the wealth of India's objects and heritage is in India, this book happens to focus on objects that are in collections outside.
Wonderful. I hope that answers your question, Siddhant. And ma'am, we have time for one last question. If you could tell us something about the cover of the book, it's an absolutely stunning image. If you could tell us something about that.
The falcon, I'm sorry I can't get it back on the screen, but
that's all right.
So it is an object that we think was Shah Jahan, so Emperor Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, who commissioned that fantastic peacock throne, which no longer exists, which once had the Kohinoor diamond in it, and the Timur ruby, and all of those. It seems to have been an object in his personal collection. And what you're seeing, of course, is this falcon with enamel work, but with rubies and diamonds and onyx and sapphire and emeralds all inset into it in an absolutely fantastic manner. And why do we think it is Shah Jahan's personal a jeweled piece? Because on the back of the perch on which the falcon is sitting is the name inscribed Ruzbihan. And Ruzbihan is the name of the of Shah Jahan's personal jewelry treasure keeper, the person who looked after all Shah Jahan's own personal collection, as opposed to a royal collection, but his own personal one. And we think that Shah Jahan probably thought of it, maybe had it right beside him as an object that he could look at and admire. Mm-hmm. And of course, incidentally, in Sufi thought, the falcon returning to perch on the hand of its owner is likened to the soul returning to God. So there's wow. Also some mystical ideas in it. So
that is absolutely beautiful. It's like like you said, the treasure. You know, the book is really Indian treasure and history, art, culture, religion, so much more. So thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderfully illuminating session. I think that's all the time we have, and we have to wrap up now. But thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my enthusiasm for the objects that comprise India. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Vidya Dehejia, for this illuminating session. Thanks to our audience and all our partners that have made this possible. Tata Literature Live, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej, continues with many more sessions. Do check out the website for the full schedule. And if you wish to spend some time in a virtual bookshop, head on to landmarkxcite.com, our knowledge partner. Coming up in a couple of minutes is Uncommon Sense, a straight talk by Steven Pinker. Keep watching Tata Literature Live. Thank you.